Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more. The Prose Edda. We are continuing reading through the introduction of the book. So let's go ahead and hop into this. The title Edda and the question of authorship. The origin of the use of the word Edda as a title is elusive. In 13th century Icelandic, the term Edda means great-grandmother, which would have been a fitting title for a compilation of traditional stories, but we will never know for sure how the name came to be applied. The original 13th century manuscript is long lost, and it is not known whether the word Edda was even in its title. The name Edda first appears in a riveting 13th century manuscripts, in surviving 13th century manuscripts, as a subtitle referring to only a part of the compilation. Two related terms, Eddaregla and Eddalist, referring to the rules in the art of poetry, also appear in the 14th century manuscripts. From these terms and their usage, we infer that the word Edda has become associated with the traditional verse, and by late medieval becomes associated with the traditional verse. And by the late medieval times, the Edda was regarded in Iceland as the authoritative handbook for training poets in traditional verse forms. It has long been assumed that the learned and quarrelsome Icelandic chieftain Snorri Sturluson is the author of the Edda. The main evidence for Snorri's authorship is the following short passage from the Codex Upsalensis, an early 14th century Icelandic manuscript containing the Edda. The book is called Edda. Snorri Sturluson compiled, literally assembled it in a way that it is arranged here. First, it tells about the Aesir, the gods, and the Ymir, the primordial giant. Then comes the poetic section, or poetic diction action, or diction section, with the poetic names of many things, and lastly a poem called The Last List of Meters, which Snorri comprised about King Hakon and Duke Sku. The passage outlines the main contents of the Edda, and although Snorri is named as the compiler of the work, it is not clear from the passage whether Snorri is the author of more than the list of meters. The other main manuscript of the Edda are also ambiguous about Snorri's connection to the work. Nevertheless, the mentions of Snorri in the manuscripts have greatly influenced Snorri's acceptance as the author of the entire work. But who was Snorri? He was the son of Sturla, an upstart chieftain from western Iceland, whose sons and grandchildren lent the family name of Sturlung, the descendants of Sturla, to the Sturlung Age, a turbulent time in the history of Iceland in the first half of the 13th century. Born in 1178 or 1179, Snorri was 2 years old when his life took an unexpected turn. John Lopson, Iceland's most powerful and cultured leader, offered to raise Snorri in order to settle a feud. It was unusual for a child to be fostered in this way by a man of a higher social status than his father. So Snorri's father saw the offer as a sign of respect. Snorri spent the next 16 years at Oddi, John Lopson's estate, and an important center of learning in medieval Iceland. When he left Oddi, Snorri married one of the wealthiest women in Iceland and soon became a prominent chieftain. In 1215 and again in 1222, Snorri was elected the Althing's law speaker, the highest official position in the Old Icelandic Free State. As a sign of his status, Snorri built at the site of the Althing an unusually large turf building where he and his men lived during the 2-week period of the assembly, and it is instructive that the 13th century chieftain named this residence Valhalla after the hall of the chief Norse god Odin. Snorri was extremely ambitious and his life was full of disputes and enemies. To increase his prestige and power at home, he sailed to Norway 2 times, where he made an ill-advised alliances and conflicting factions within the Norwegian royal family. In the 1230s, the number and reach of Snorri's enemies in Iceland and Norway grew dangerously. He had married his daughters to rising Icelandic chieftains, but the marriages ended and the alliances failed. In the year 1241, 2 of Snorri's former sons-in-law, recruited by the Norwegian king, who was extending his power to Iceland, attacked and surprised Snorri at his estate in Reykjavik, in western Iceland. They found him hiding in his cellar and killed him. Snorri was mentioned in many 13th century Icelandic writings, and they allow us to know more about him than about most other individuals in medieval Europe. Still, we can only guess at some aspects of Snorri's life, including the extent of his writings. The books that tradition attributes to him, the history of the kings of Norway, Heimskringla, and the Prose Edda, indicate that he spent time gathering information for his future writings. During his travels in Scandinavia, the opening section of Heimskringla, which covers the earliest mythic and legendary period, is called the Saga of the Inglings. Like the Edda, this work tells ancient stories and intersperses its prose with Eddic and Skaldic verses. However, the stories of the 2 works are then distinguished by the differences of fact and detail. All right, we'll go ahead and, well, let's continue. The parts of the Edda. The Edda is divided into four parts. It begins with a short dialogue, a self-standing unit that differs significantly from the rest of the Edda in sentence structure, subject matter, and the kind of genealogical information it gives. In a Norse culture that was in the process of absorbing elements of classical learning, the prologue attempts to elevate the status of the Edda by equating Norse stories with those from the Greco Roman tradition. It also tries to make the Edda stories more palatable to medieval Christians by harmonizing Norse beliefs with Christian concepts. The prologue may have been part of the original text, or some or all of it may have been added later. The second and main section of is known as Gylfaginning and is the core of the Edda. No one can learn about Scandinavian mythology without it, since it is our best source for the story of creation, the struggles of the gods, and the events leading to the destruction of the universe. The text of Gylfaginning is remarkably similar to the all is similar in all the important manuscripts of the Edda. Gylfaginning means diluting or ginning of Gylfi, a reference not to the stories of King Gylfi of Sweden learns from the Aesir, but to Gylfi's realization that he was the victim of an elaborate optical delusion. Gylfaginning is written entirely as a dialogue between Gylfi and three formidable godlike figures who are at the center of the deception. Gylfi disguises himself as a traveler named Gangleri, a name meaning strider, walker, or wanderer, and journeys to visit the Aesir. This mysterious people is said to be newly arrived in the north, and Gangleri seeks to discover the source of their power. In the Aesir's uh, majestic but illusory hall, Gangleri Gylfi meets three manifestations of Odin, high, just as high, and third. These strange lordly individuals sit on thrones, one above the other. Gangleri questions them, and story by story, they reveal what they know. Gangleri's dialogue with Odin's three manifestations resembles contests of wisdom found in the Eddic poems, such as the Lay of Vafthrudnir, where Odin pits his mastery and mythic knowledge against the giants Vafthrudnir, and Norse wisdom contests were adversarial, and Gangleri is told at the start that he will not escape unharmed unless he grows wiser. Gangleri's method is to probe the Aesir with questions such as who is the highest or oldest of all the gods? How were the earth and the sky made? The richly detailed answers often touch the troubling topics, many participating in the destruction of the world. The third section is called Skaldskaparmál, and unlike Gylfaginning, it varies considerably from manuscript to manuscript. The name Skaldskaparmál is telling. Skald, as mentioned earlier, is the Old Norse word for poet. Skapar means creation or craft, while mal is language or diction. Hence, Skaldskaparmál means the language of poetry or poetic diction. The stories in Skaldskaparmál give background for references and allusions found in Old Norse verse, and these explanations are a priceless repository of Scandinavian lore. There is little doubt that Gylfaginning and Skaldskaparmál were written in different times and in somewhat different styles. Whereas Gylfaginning is entirely in dialogue, Skaldskaparmál is written in the combination of dialogue and third-person storytelling. It would seem that these two sections of the Edda were gathered into one book after they were written separately. Still, the two fit remarkably well together, containing almost no repetition. Both Skaldskaparmál and Gylfaginning tell myths, but Skaldskaparmál also recounts tales of the legendary heroes. Some of these heroic legends can be dated to a time before the Viking Age, known as the Migration Period, from the 5th to the 7th centuries, when warrior bands and tribes invaded the collapsing Roman Empire. Stories that originated during this era became the basis for epic cycles that were popular during the Viking Age and continued to be told in the 13th century when the Edda was written. Among the stories gathered into Skaldskaparmál are those of kings and warriors whose fame springs from a mixture of history and myth. One of these is the legendary King Jormunrik, also known as Ermenrik in late Roman or Old English sources. This tragic figure ruled over the vast East Gothic kingdom of horsemen and the Ukrainian steppes until attacked by the Huns in the year 376. Skaldskaparmál also tells the story of the ancient Danish warrior King Hrolf Kraki, who, much like King Arthur in Celtic lore or Charlemagne from the Frankish legends, surrounded himself with 12 champions. Hrolf's warriors and berserkers are treated more fully in the saga of King Hrolf Kraki, an episodic collection of old Scandinavian tales that has similarities to the Old English epic Beowulf. Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, whose lineage is traced to Odin, is the best known hero in Skaldskaparmál. He and its Volsung family serve as the basis of a series of epic stories, including those about Attila the Hun and the Burgundian tribesmen who covet Sigurd's treasure, the Rhinegold. Sigurd becomes entangled in a tragic love triangle with a Burgundian princess who later marries Attila, and a Valkyrie who disobeys Odin. Extensive versions of the Sigurd story also survive in the saga of the Volsungs, the poetic Edda, uh, Tridic's saga, and the the South German epic poem, the Nibelungenlied, where Sigurd is known as Siegfried. Richard Wagner made Siegfried the hero of his King cycle, but most closely followed the storyline of what happened to Sigurd and his Volsung ancestors found in the Eddas of the saga of the Volsungs. The fourth and final section of the Edda is the poetic list of meters called Hatatal in Old Icelandic. There is no doubt about Hatatal's authorship. It was composed by Snorri Sturluson, probably early in his career, as an attempt to curry favor with the Norwegian king Hakon Narsen and his father-in-law Skully, a jarl who was given the title of Duke Hatatal, is an ambitious, somewhat pedantic work, whose 102 stanzas demonstrate often small differences in poetic meters and obscure usages of poetic devices. Prose commentary offering technical explanations is interspersed among the verses of this long poem. The poem is a treasure for those with a knowledge of Old Icelandic and interested in the intricacies of Norse poetry. Because of the technical and obscure nature of Hatatal, it is not included in this nor in most translations. Yeah, so that ends this episode. Yeah, we learn a little bit of the history of the actual Prose Edda and similar um, poetic sources. But like I said, it's just part of the introduction of the book. I'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.